Good morning. Just want to check that everybody can hear us. We're happy to be here. Welcome, Norway. Give them a minute.
Oh, I see. Yeah, you weren't kidding.
Yes, a little bit.
Delay. Yeah.
So good morning. Let me just set the framework today. We have Theresa Palmer here with us today. She is a senior program manager on the Connections and Gateways team, and she's going to talk to us all about connectors today. So one of my favorite things about PowerApps is its ability to connect to whatever kind of data you need, whether it's data at Microsoft and using our software in Office 365 or in Dynamics 365 or in Azure, but also we can connect to tons of data systems outside of that as well. So she is one of the people responsible for the hard work behind the many connectors we have. And today she's going to give us some best practices. She's going to show us some things we might not be aware of, and she's going to help us use connections much better. So Tessa, take it away.
Of course. Thank you so much, Audrey.
No problem.
Okay, so we are going to flip.
Yeah, you can turn, and then the green button.
Perfect. Get back. Okay, so yeah, we're going to get jump right into it and start talking about connectors. And we're going to cover them in both Microsoft Flow and PowerApps, and just give you a little bit of an overview of our different connectors. Okay, so some things I'm going to talk about today. A quick introduction to these products. Hopefully you're joining our webinar because you're already excited about Microsoft Flow and PowerApps, but I'll give you a really brief overview in case this is your first time. We're going to talk about what a connector actually is, how you use it, and then if you're interested, we also have an extensibility and a partner program so that you can build your own connector and what that would look like. As well. And then we'll save some time at the end for Q&A. There is a chat window that you might have already seen and be contributing to. So Audrey is taking a look at any questions that you post in your chat window, and we can bring them up and talk about them later. So jumping right into it, Microsoft Flow helps non-developers build and automate workflows across many different applications and services. So you can do things like get notifications, you can sync across multiple services, you can do things like approvals, and I'll show you a little bit more about what that actually looks like. So within a flow itself, for example, a notification flow, we usually talk about a few different objects within that flow. The first one, the very first thing that kind of initiates that workflow is a trigger, and that will kick off the actual flow. And then there's subsequent items, which we call actions, where they might do perform a series of actions or operations depending on what that workflow is automating. And you'll see all of this in action a little bit later. So on to PowerApps. So PowerApps is all about building custom business applications with little to no code. And so you can imagine instead of going to IT and requesting them build a custom application for a specific scenario, users can actually use our designer and editor to drag and drop and build these really rich applications and connect them to live data as well. So they can connect them to all of the different services and data sources that we support within our connector platform. So within this is a quick example of the designer, and I'll show you that a little bit more, but you can see some different pieces that allow you to build up the screens that ultimately represent the application. And within that, I'll show you in a few slides just how the connectors plug into that different bit as well, because all of your applications can run with data that you use in your system and ultimately update and kind of create data within your system as well. Okay, so what is a connector? We're talking about all the great ways to use them and benefit with them in our platform, but what is a connector itself? So a connector, we talk about it being a wrapper around a service that already exists. So you can see some of these examples here on the screen. But this wrapper, this connector, allows that external service to communicate back with Flow and PowerApps and vice versa. So it really creates that connection point between the two different products and services and more. You can integrate many within one application, but really lets you get the richness of that external service back within Flow and PowerApps. And so as a quick note, we have over 150 connectors today, and we're actually releasing more and more connectors every single day and every single week.
Wow, that's awesome. Yeah, that's great.
So to show quickly where connectors show up in the product, so within Flow, as I mentioned about how you build up a workflow, you have a notion of triggers and actions. So this is a quick example of one of our connectors, Asana, which is a project and task management system. And so you can see here, this lists out some example triggers that we support for Asana. So when a task is completed or when a project is created, and then the types of actions that we have. So you can create new projects, add comments, and more and more. So typically when we build a connector, we start with an initial set of actions and triggers, but we add to it as we get customer requests or as we see some new scenarios light up as people are actually using them within the systems. And then one last thing about where the connector kind of components show up in Flow, they have a notion of templates, which is kind of suggested use cases or suggested workflows that you might use for a specific service. And that's another place that you'll see the individual connectors show up. So you can see in this case, the templates on the side, for example, bring in multiple different services, multiple different connectors all into one workflow. And you can do, you can also build up your custom scenarios as well. So where do connectors show up and how do you use them in PowerApps? And again, I'll give examples of all of this as well. But only the actions of a connector work in PowerApps because, again, it's more of an interactive capability. You can actually link flows and PowerApps together, which is a whole different webinar. I'm sure that's up there as well. But
yes, we're going to do one of those.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
But what you'll see typically in a PowerApp is that a connector actions can show up, say, tied to a gallery or to a button or something like this. So in this particular example, we have a screen that takes in a few fields, and this button is actually tied to that create task action in the same connector. So we'll give a few examples live, but really think about it as the actions within a connector or the individual operations that can be done. You can use those within PowerApps as well. Okay, so with that, I'll jump into my first demo about using connectors across all of these different products. So starting, again, I gave the quick overview, and I'm assuming most folks are familiar with Flow and PowerApps. If you're not, it's very easy to sign up. If you go to flow.microsoft.com or powerapps.microsoft.com, you can just sign in with any of your work email addresses, and then depending on what you want to try out, you might start with our free offering or try out with a trial for one of the subscriptions as well. So if you haven't done it already, I definitely suggest go and trying to sign up today. So when you sign into Flow, we'll start here, for example, you can get a quick overview of what the different services does, some examples of templates, and you can also see a list, which is my favorite section of the website, which is all of the different connectors that we offer. So scrolling down, you can actually see this is the list of everything that we currently have available. And as I said, it's over 150 connectors today, and we're adding more and more every week. So just giving you a quick overview of all of the different things that we support.
Now, there will be, just to let you know, there will be a bit of variance between what you see in PowerApps and what you see in Flow. But for the most part, it's a good idea to come and visit this page, because when you click on any of the connectors, you'll be able to have access to not only flow-driven templates on that topic, but you'll have access to the documentation. And it's kind of small, but it's right above the big button in the middle of the page. You can click on that and go straight to the documentation.
Yeah, so that list of connectors is a great place to see what we're currently supporting. And then as Audrey said, if you click on an individual connector, you get a brief overview of what's actually possible with that connector. Maybe it's a service you've never heard of and you're interested in. It can also, in the flow scenario, gives you some suggested templates or use cases that you might want to use the connector for. And then, yes, it can link you directly to the connector reference, which actually gives you a textual representation of all of those actions and triggers that I mentioned within the connector. So it's really easy for you to see what's actually possible if you connect to any of our 150 different connectors. And that's important because the services that we connect to are, they're all very rich and they have a ton of different capabilities. But you might see when you come into Flow or PowerApps that we only support a subset of those initially. And that's just based off of what we started in order to release the connector, and based on customer feedback, we can add to it. So you can see something like SharePoint. If you scroll down on the right-hand side, you can see all of the different operations that we support, which is quite a lot. But if you go to something like GitHub, which is a bug and source control system that we actually only have one action and then a few triggers as well. So some of them are relatively small to start with as we put it out there and get feedback from all of our customers. And some of them are quite rich based off of how much work we've been doing on the connector and all of the great feedback we've gotten from you guys as well. So if you see a connector that you're interested in, but it's missing an operation, definitely come to our community site. So there's PowerApps and Flow. Both of them have ideas site where you can submit what you're interested in.
We're watching, so please do.
And they also have tags that help us find it a little bit easier. You can tag it with a connector request. Or if you just put it out there, as Audrey said, we are watching and can find the questions that you're looking for. And that really helps us build back into the systems that we're creating.
I just want to add a point on the idea forms. It's really good, even though you guys know me, you guys can email me, we're close like that. If you put them on the forum, though, people can vote on them. So it's better than emailing me, even though I'm glad to receive your email. It's better to put it on the forum so that people can vote, and then we can learn which ones are more important to the community.
Exactly. So that was a little bit on the reference docs and actually how you can contribute back to a connector. Now I'll hop into how you actually use a connector, and I'll show both Flow and PowerApps. So starting with Flow, the easiest way is really to use one of the templates. So if you're interested in SharePoint and you do a lot of items around, here's a great example. So this scenario, this template is when I get an email attachment, save it to my SharePoint document library. So you might find, every time I get emails, say from Audrey, she has some great reference attachments. What I'm doing is every time I'm checking that and I'm going and I'm saving off the email so that I can check something later. Well, instead of having to do that manually, I can actually create this flow, and that will happen automatically for me. So you can see here it uses O365 Outlook as well a SharePoint. In both cases, I've actually already created what we call connections. And this is an important part because in order to use these services, these connectors that we're showing, you actually need to log in to your own account. So if it hadn't created an account for me, I can actually come here and create a new connection. So since they're already set up, I can just hit continue. And now what it's doing is it loads that template that has the different pieces, and you can see some of it's already populated for me. I can also choose to go and build, customize it a little bit further. So I can say, okay, when this email reaches my inbox, I can add conditions, for example, so I can make sure that it's only from Audrey, or I can make something a little bit more complex or basic. It all just depends on the scenario that you're looking for. And I will delete that back up. Okay, so it's going to take the attachment and create a file and put it over here into a particular site that I want to connect to. So again, some customization might be required depending on the scenario. Some of it might be relatively straightforward. And just with that, I can create the flow and it'll be off and running for me. So we have different templates based off of the connector that you're going from. So you can, again, click any of these different ones that we support and actually see suggested templates. Or you can go from an initial list of templates that have everything kind of pre-built for you. And you can go based off of a scenario. So say I'm looking to improve notifications. Here's a great one that I didn't even know that I needed, but I probably do. So when I get an email from my boss, send me a push notification, something that can definitely help your day-to-day, and you'd be a little bit more productive. And again, with just a click of a button, you can create a flow. Now you can also go from scratch. And when you go from scratch, it's a slightly different experience because you're kind of building the scenario yourself and you're thinking of the different connectors that you want to use. So if I come into, again, the designer, the first thing I get to choose is what connector I want to use to kind of trigger my flow. So since I already did Outlook, let me scroll down and do something a little bit different. Let's see, we could do, I think there's a SharePoint one here. And of course, I can always search for them as well.
One of my favorite is reoccurrence. I don't know.
Oh yeah, we can definitely do that one as well. So again, with triggers, it's all about something happening. And as Audrey said, you can also set it up to just happen on a schedule. So if I do a reoccurrence or schedule, this can do some every 1 minute or every 1 hour or every 1 day, and is a good way to kind of initiate a workflow. So once I have that set up, say I can look for another connector. So choosing Microsoft Planner, and this shows all of the different actions that I have. So I can do anything such as get a task, or update a task, or do different operations within my Planner account. So again, I'd already created a connection, so it automatically added it for me, but I can also be prompted and log in to create a new connection here. Okay, so now you can see this is like one of the particular actions within this connector. I can fill it out to actually use the operation. And again, just by creating the flow, then I would have an actual workflow that I would go back and save. And if I go back to my flows, you can see that I already have one configured that's running pretty regularly for me as well. So just depending on the different scenarios you're looking to automate or support, you might start from templates, you might start from a specific connector. Again, if you use SharePoint every day or use Gmail every day or any of these other connectors, you might start from that side. Or you can, completely customize it based off of a scenario that you might have in mind. So that's kind of showing how the different connectors might show up in Flow, very similar to those screenshots that I was showing in the deck. I'll flip over to PowerApps to show you something similar.
While she's flipping over, I just want to remind you, I think Tessa said this, but when you are working in Flow, you're working from the philosophy of a trigger to an action. However, when you're working in PowerApps, you're working from an action. And usually you'll associate that with a button of some type or an unselect statement. So a little bit different approach in the two applications, but the same connectors are available.
Yeah, and so when you think about building an application, you're going to probably list out some of your data, you're going to interact with it, edit, update, delete, create, all of those types of actions. And so again, depending on the scenario that you're looking for, that you need that custom application for, the way that the connectors might show up can be a little bit different. So I started in PowerApps. I'd already created an account and I chose to create a new application. And very similar, you can start from scratch if you know exactly the scenario you're looking for. Or you can try starting with one of a data source that you might already want to use. So again, I'll start with SharePoint. And one of the reasons that this is quite nice is because it kind of launches you in to the PowerApps experience and the formula editing and how data works, all of these connectors work within PowerApps without you having to know too much about it from the get-go. So instead of having that blank canvas, it actually gives you something to start with, and you can customize it from there. So in this case, I actually chose a connection to SharePoint that I'd already created. I chose a specific SharePoint site, and now I'm choosing a SharePoint list to automatically build my application off of. And then I hit connect, and then it starts building everything up for me. So again, you can always start from scratch, but sometimes, especially if it's based off of a data source that you do want to use, I do want to build it off of a SharePoint list. Starting from one of those connected apps is a great way to kind of dive right in without.
Yeah, I agree. That's a great, easy way too.
So you can see here, actually what they've done on this left-hand side is that it shows all of the different application screens that I have, and I actually can run the app right from the get-go. So no customization yet. You can see I have multiple screens. It has different items from my SharePoint list, and everything's here. I can already edit or delete, and everything's kind of tied in together. So depending on your scenario, this actually might be all you need, and you can just, you're off to the races already. Sometimes you might need a little bit of customization. So you can see here, for example, it's chosen certain fields within my gallery that might not be what I wanted. So there's a few different ways that you can update this. One of them is actually by selecting the item itself. And you can see here we have a formula bar that actually maps it to a particular value. And just by deleting that value name, it gives me a suggestion. The IntelliSense kind of builds out all of the different things that I might want to put there. So instead, I'm actually going to flip it over to a title. An even easier way, perhaps, is by using this right-hand pane. You can see that it's giving me information about the type of data that's mapped to this gallery, and I can actually use the drop-downs to change the different information. So instead of this particular field, I want a different field from my SharePoint list. So you can see there's a few different things that you can customize, and depending on what you're looking for, you can really easily, just by clicking and kind of dragging and dropping, or typing it if you're more familiar with a formula bar, to really build up the application that you want. So this, again, is all connected to a SharePoint site, and this is what we actually call a tabular connector. So it's based off of a table of data that you can view, edit, update, or delete. So it kind of has that whole set of operations already tied nicely into this. You can see we have a details screen as well as an edit screen over here. So if I wanted to extend it even further, for example, as a quick scenario, what I'm going to do is, when I go to edit a particular field in that list, instead of just submitting the form and updating that field, I also want it to create a task for me within Planner. This is kind of where you can tie those buttons or actions into connector actions as well. So you can see here, by selecting the submit item button, which right now is tied to submitting the form, I can add another action to that same operation so that it does more than one thing. And in this case, I'm actually going to go back and create a connection to, or bring in a connection just before in order to use the action for that connector, you actually have to bring in a connection from that connector as well. So you can see here, these are all of the connections that I already have in my account. If I go to create a new connection, this gives me, again, that list of 150 connectors that I can choose to bring in any of them that I want into this one application. In this case, I'm actually going to use a connection to Planner that I already had. So I selected my connection, and now you can see here I have not just the SharePoint site that I brought in before, I also have my Planner connection. And so now I'm going to go back to that button, and the way that we use the connectors within PowerApps kind of from scratch is you're actually, each of the actions map to a function or an operation within PowerApps. So I would always start with the name of the connector. So you can see here it says Planner. And then if I keep going, autocomplete or the IntelliSense is suggesting the different operations that I support. So if I go Planner, and then again, you can start seeing the syntax, Planner dot, And now it maps to all of the different operations. And actually, if I go back to our reference documentation, and this is always on docs.microsoft.com/connectors if you want to start there. And I search for planner, you can see those same names of what I was doing is actually listed in the documentation. So the IntelliSense is great within PowerApps, but that's something if you want to kind of know what you're typing beforehand, the documentation can help as well. So here I can create a task. Either I already know my plan ID, which I'll grab in a second. I can actually bring in fields from the rest of my app. So for example, if I want to use data card title, I can bring that in instead of having to actually type. So instead of it being hard coded, I can actually pass in fields from around my application. And again, these are notions within PowerApps that you can kind of extend into using the different connectors as well. And depending on the different fields, you might again use the reference documentation to give you some hints about where you can find that information. Or sometimes you might even use multiple operations kind of tied together to really build out what you're looking for. And kind of when in doubt, you can always go back to the actual service that you're using. So in this case, I'm in the Planner UI, and I can see that plan ID that I want is actually right within Planner. So all of that information together, the service that you're looking to use, PowerApps documentation, as well as the connector reference, all three of those things can come together to actually tell you how to use the different operations. So with that, I've added the action to the button. And now this time when I run my app and I hit submit item, it's going to not only update the item, it's also going to go back and create that task within Planner as well. Did you want to jump in with anything, Audrey?
Yes, I just wanted you to slow down a little bit on how you got that ID for Planner. So if you could go back to Planner and kind of point that out again, how did you get the ID?
Yeah, and so that's in this specific case, it's for Planner. It actually depends on the service or data source or connector that you're using. And so that's where, depending on the reference docs and Planner itself, between all of those things, you can find the information that you're looking for. So I actually copied it out from Planner itself. But there might be other ways depending on what connector you're using.
And this is the method I use as well. So you would actually open the planner that you want to connect to, and at the end of the URL will be the ID. You won't be able to do anything with this planner connector without an ID. So it's good to note that down.
And that's pretty typical for many of the services, depending on what you're using, that they need an identifier in some way. Sometimes you can use some of our other actions to get an ID, and sometimes you can get them directly from the service. So really, again, just depends on what you're connecting to. So with that went a little bit longer than I had intended, but I'll flip back into my deck. So that's how you actually use connectors within Flow and PowerApps. And I gave some specific examples based off of those connectors, but depending on what you're looking to do in the scenarios, things might vary slightly. So definitely lean on the reference documentation that we have, your experience with the external products as well, you using Gmail or SharePoint or Planner or all those different things. And then when in doubt, definitely reach out through our forums for more information. Okay, so the next section that I'm going to spend a little bit of time on, and we want to make sure that we save time for Q&A, but is actually about building a connector. So as I mentioned, we do have a partner program that allows folks to bring in their own connectors into our ecosystem. So we have over 150, as I said, connectors today, and many of those are actually built by external partners. So say you own a product, a service that you have users of course, today. Instead of having, to build individual integrations, you can actually go and leverage our platform, our connectivity platform, to build out. So if you want users to be able to customize your application, they might be able to build something like a Power App on top of it. Or if you want them to be able to build notifications and workflows, they can leverage Flow once you have a connector in our ecosystem. So all of that kind of jumping into why you would want to build a connector. So as I mentioned, we have many different services, and of course your product can show up in that list as well. And by building a connector, you really quickly expand the number of systems you integrate with without having to build those integrations natively into your application. So, just by having this one connector, you can immediately connect to over 150 other systems, and all you had to build was one integration. And then also, as our ecosystem grows, you get those capabilities dynamically, again, without having to actually build anything on your side. So in order, once you have that connector, you're offering your users all those integrations to services that they're already using easily, again, without having to go back and update your own service. So they're already using SQL Server or Slack or Yammer or all of these different pieces, and just by having this one integration point, they can really take advantage of it along with your own service. And then, of course, you can drive more usage to your application by having kind of another entry point and increasing the discoverability by exposing it next to services that folks might walk into. So say they come in and they're a user of Asana, then they see your service nearby, and it can expose that to all of the now users of Asana and Flow can also see your product as well. So a few different ways that building a connector can actually benefit your service. So as far as the connectors, that was why you might want to build it. What the actual user themselves can do, and I showed it really quickly by using a connector, but once your service is in PowerApps and Flow, users can build the custom line of business applications that can extend it, so they can have one application that, again, uses certain capabilities that they need day to day in addition to your service as well. So they have everything kind of within that one application. And they can also build those workflows, again, interacting with more than just that one service or the notifications that you support, for example. They can really go and customize it. So it benefits, of course, your platform. And then the way that your users can do it is really they can build all of their custom capabilities without having to go back and kind of wait for you to add them natively. And as I mentioned, increasing the adoption. So this is an example of our template screen, for example. I believe this is on our Dynamics one. So if you select Dynamics, you see all of the templates that are related to Dynamics, and also all of the other services that are lined up with these dynamic scenarios. So you can see if your service had a sample template between Dynamics and your service, it would show up in the same list next to all of the other integrations. So you're increasing adoption and the visibility of your service as well. And then just, I keep saying over 150 different connectors. This list actually isn't all of them, but it can give you a quick peek into all of the different types of services. We have all different verticals, storage, email, bug tracking, task management, notifications. So just everything kind of across the board, and we're expanding this every week as well. Okay, so building a connector, what does that involve, and how does that kind of work in the overall process? So we try to make it very easy, and we've actually been adding more and more to these capabilities, especially since if you were around at some of the announcements we made at Build or at Inspire a few months ago. So we're definitely trying to make this as lightweight as possible. So pretty much there's about 4 steps. You could say it's even less than that, but you can start by onboarding. You can reach out to us if you're interested. There's also some documentation online where you can get started. You can develop what we call a custom API or custom connector actually directly within Flow or PowerApps, and I'll show that quickly. You go through a series of validation, which you can do within that same UI experience, and also our team can help with some of the validations. And then you can submit it to our team for publishing so it can show up alongside those other 150 different connectors.
Just one quick question, Tessa. Can you give me an example of what kind of connector someone might want to build?
So usually what'll happen is they're already, they own a connector or a service. They have an API that's publicly available. So that's one of the requirements.
So like a line of business application that they own. that we don't offer a connector for because we don't know about it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So you might already have a service, can be a line of business application. It can be something that might not even have a total visible, like a user interface. It might just be programmatic APIs.
Okay.
But whatever, this is a way that users can take advantage of that service with all of the other pieces as well.
Yeah, and then also I think you mentioned earlier that so someone like an ISV, for instance, could have an application that they build on one of our platforms, and maybe they need a connector to connect to something they're using, so they can actually build that connector and include that in that package, so that they can, basically leverage that across all of our portals then.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, once they have building a REST API is one step that people might have anyways to take advantage of other integrations.
Yeah.
And so then building a connector really lets that integration point light up across Flow and PowerApps and Logic Apps as well.
That's awesome. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so having a REST API is one of the requirements. And again, it can be in development kind of while your connector's in development, but we do kind of hit public endpoints that are available. And then we do have a set of supported authentication types, and you need to kind of fall within that requirement as well. So I'll show you really quickly what that looks like by actually building a connector for you. So as I mentioned, within Flow and PowerApps, both of them have an entry point for what we call custom connectors. So if you go into the gear in your top right-hand area, custom connectors are one of the options. And I'll just show you what that looks like in PowerApps as well, the same kind of entry point. So you can get started by creating a custom connector. And this is really the development experience that will let you build a connector within your own tenant that you can customize and validate and test and even share within your tenant for other users to test before you bring it to us for certification. So the full kind of development experience is actually within the product, so you can really get that end-to-end feel before you come to our team to sign off on it. So there's a few different ways that you can create a connector. You can create it from scratch if you'd like, but typically ISVs that we work with might already have a Swagger or an Open API file, or they actually might have worked with another tool such as Postman. So pretty much if you already have a definition of your API, you can actually come right here and import it and really quickly get started. If you don't have one and you don't want to completely start from scratch within our user interface, you can also look at something like Postman, where you can actually create and save requests against your API and save them out into what we call, or what they call, a Postman collection, and import that one. So we have some documentation online that dives into it a little bit more. But pretty much that's a great option if you don't already have a Swagger file, and is something that I would suggest. It's as simple as figuring out the authentication, making a different request. You can actually send and test out the request and the response all within Postman, and then you can actually save the different pieces and actually just import from there. So once you import it, you can have something kind of started so that you're not going from scratch, or as I mentioned, you can actually build it all within the UI. So once you've imported a file, you can hit continue, and then you can go into our security definition. And so you can see here we support a few different types of authentication. One is basic auth, which is username and password. Another one is API key, which you can choose, is that going into the header or a query parameter. Or finally, we support standard OAuth 2 implementations. We do have some custom ones that you can see here. So for example, if you're looking to use Todoist or Stripe or GitHub OAuth specifically, or you can use our generic OAuth 2 provider. And so you might notice now that we flipped into this connector development that we're talking much more on a developer terminology. So we're talking about the authentication type, client ID, client secret. These are things that we expect a developer or someone who's familiar with the API to be able to do, but actually the user doesn't necessarily need to know this level of detail. When they're using a connector, all that they need to know is, for example, what their username and password is, or what key they need to provide. They actually don't need to know how it's configured behind the scenes. So just to be clear about who is kind of a consumer of a connector and who's the developer of a connector. At that point, once you have the security defined, you can also come in here and create actions and triggers. So actions, again, are those operations that typically either create, update, or delete, or even list out different objects. And so that's where your actions would come in, or you can create a trigger. And the triggers that we support are webhook triggers. And so those are systems or configurations that will kind of register an endpoint and take updated requests. Or you can build polling triggers as well that will kind of check for anything to be updated. So you can see here, this whole UI will kind of guide you through building out the different operations that you have. So if I quickly just let me make sure that I have this collection saved. I'll just show what it looks like to import it. Perfect. And now I can come in here really quickly and actually upload it from our different pieces. And let's see where I saved that. Okay, I think it's in my documentation, my documents. We'll have to grab that one in just a second. Okay, so once I have the definition configured, I actually can come over to our final tab and test out the connector. So that's one of the great pieces of what we have within our system. And it actually allows you to go and dynamically try out all of the endpoints that you've either defined in your Postman collection, or perhaps in when you've done it dynamically, before you actually try to use it within PowerApps or use it within Flow. And that testing really helps you set up a different level of validation to ensure that the actual operations that you've added end up working as you expect. So once you've created the connector, you'll actually be able to go and save it and share it and use it directly within individual flows, so that folks have some of that capability and they can actually go and try it out and build flows or build PowerApps actually using it as well. So once all of that's said and done, you can actually come to us for certification. And the easiest way to do that is we have, again, either through the forums, you can reach out directly for there, or if you search, and we can make this available, there's all of our blog posts. We have different guides on how to actually come and build and certify a connector for Flow and PowerApps. We also support connectors and logic apps, which is an Azure offering very similar to Flow. And then also we have all of these, excuse me, this information within the documentation as well. So if you come in here through documentation, you can see partners and ISVs. And again, it gives you some details about how to build and submit the connector for certification. So end to end, it's quite quick to build a connector. I think it's something that we'll dive into a little further on a separate webinar, just because this one has both kind of how to use a connector and a brief intro on how to actually build one. But if you are a service provider and that's something that you're interested in and you want to get your users into Flow and PowerApps and take advantage of all of the other integrations that we have, it's definitely something I would suggest trying out. And we're happy to put on mini hackathons or anything that could help within that development process. So with that, I think we can switch over to some Q&A, and depending on how active folks have been.
I have some questions.
Okay, great.
So I'm going to go back up here. So the key question, I'm going to go back, is regarding the nav connector.
Mm-hmm.
So Diana Works said that she's having some trouble with the nav connector. And she says, do you know if nav on-prem authentication has to be set up as nav user password instead of Windows in order to work with the connector?
So that is a good question. I think that's something I would start. I don't know that one off the top of my head, so we'd have to kind of investigate and follow up with you, Diana. That should definitely be in the documentation or the connector reference. And if it's not, that's likely a gap in our reference that we can follow up on. But typically, it's something actually that I didn't mention to begin with, but hopefully folks can understand kind of even from Diana's question, we do support connectors to be both cloud connectors as well as on-prem instances. So for example, SharePoint, when you go to create a connection, it asks if you want to use a data gateway or having a direct connection. And so we do support in some instances on-prem connectivity, which it sounds like Diana is using, but the details of configuring that will just depend on the connector itself. So we can follow up directly with the nav team. And really quickly back to that data gateway, as Audrey kind of introduced me, I'm on the gateway and connectors team. So we do both, of course, the connectivity platform. And in order to have on-premise connectivity, we have to have what we call a gateway. So you can actually use any of this download links to get information about the data gateway and learn more about how to configure it. And that's something you would leverage if you're using on-premises instances, for example, of SQL Server or SharePoint.
Perfect. Okay. And is there anything that you suggest as far as getting started with connectors? Like, what would you suggest as far as, just what's the best way to get started using connectors in your opinion?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is actually going back to the scenarios that you're looking to support and kind of what types of things you're looking to do. So I would always suggest starting with something you're very familiar with. So email, so many of us use email every single day.
Yeah.
And so you can think about things that might make your life easier by starting with email. And so that a good way to do that is by selecting the email provider that you use.
Okay, we're good. Okay, stop for a second.
And they can give you some suggestions around the different templates. Or again, if you go from PowerApps, there's the connected applications that again can kind of, so you usually want to start from a scenario that you're looking for, but depending on connectors and maybe you don't know all of the different scenarios that we can support, you can also kind of start from that other way. So if you're looking for things like notifications or email management or all those different things, they can kind of give you suggestions based off of what you're doing. So say I started from Outlook, but here it gives me an idea about using OneNote and notifications, which of course I also use every day.
Yep.
So this one might be a really great scenario for me as well. And of course, our forums, actually, there's also a ton of, as you've mentioned multiple times, we're very active in the forums, both our users and our team.
Yeah.
And so that's a great place to kind of see what other people are doing and see if it might be relevant for what I'm doing as well.
Okay, so Diana also pointed out that the doc only mentioned needing it for SQL Server and SharePoint on-prem. It actually didn't mention nav on-prem. So we're going to actually have to follow up with you on that and see if we can get that updated.
Yep, and so we don't support on-prem instances for all connectors, so that might be a
constraint.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
So we'll just we can follow up on that one.
Yes. One more thing I want to bring out as far as getting started. Within the next week or so, you're going to notice a brand new forum called Optimizing Your Data, and it will have a subcategory called Connections and Connectors. And so it'll be also an opportunity for the community to start interacting on what they're encountering related to connectors. And so we're going to actually start motivating the community to bring out their challenges with connectors, and we're going to help each other maximize and optimize those connections.
So some of the other things that I think we glossed over really quickly, but just in case folks are thinking about more information around connectors. So you might see sometimes we have preview tags on the connectors. That just indicates that it's a little earlier in the release cycle than maybe some of our other connectors, but we do try to release everything as production ready. So don't let a preview tag kind of shy you away from actually using the connector. It's something that is quite easy. You should still get started, and that's one of the ways that we'll get feedback to ensure we're happy with the capabilities before we make it kind of remove that preview tag. The other thing you might see within when you're actually using connectors within Flow or within PowerApps is that some of them are marked as premium. And that just indicates that you need a certain SKU or certain subscription within Flow or PowerApps in order to use those different connectors. And so those are things that are listed on both of the sites around pricing. And then you can see kind of where the premium connectors might fall in depending on what you're looking to use it for. So both things that should kind of not deter you from using a connector. It just might mean that either you need to start a trial or a subscription to one of our products, or it's something that might be in a little bit earlier stage and is really looking for your feedback. But in all cases, give any of the connectors a try based off of the scenarios that you're looking for, and we're always here and eager to get your feedback. And then again, if you're a service provider, definitely take a look at all of the scenarios that we support, and if you can think of some interesting ones that interact with your service, or if you need help on that front as well, we always have some ideas based off of our users' requests. But you could show up in this list as well and then ensure that users can take advantage of all of these great integrations along with your service as well.
Do we have any questions, any comments, anything you'd like to talk about before we wrap it up? Let me know if you found this useful. I'm really interested in finding out whether or not the documentation that Tessa demoed and the information that she shared today is valuable to you, or if you want additional. We do plan to have mini webinars on the topic of connectors. We will also have, as Diana asked for, we will have webinars where we deep dive into particular connections based on the popularity of that connector. So let me know what you want, and I will make it happen, okay? Thank you so much, Tessa. I mean, I think this was extremely valuable. I actually learned a couple of things. Thank you so much. I hope to have you back again. Maybe do another deep dive with us. Thank you all for coming. Unless you have questions, we're going to end this webinar. Just give you a couple of seconds to decide. Yes, Diana, I definitely will make sure we have deeper dives, and I understand about the documentation. We have gotten that feedback before. Thank you. Canadian?
Yeah.
Really? Okay. Good catch, Diana. The t-shirt, I didn't even notice it. Yeah. Oh, elle parle français. Okay. Very good, Diana. We will continue to work in multiple languages and talk to you all soon. Au revoir.